Welcome to Leadership Trailblazers. I'm Lois Burton, Executive Coach and Leadership Development Specialist. I've been working with leaders for 25 years, and I've been privileged to work with hundreds of leaders doing extraordinary things. In today's episode of Leadership Trailblazers, we're going to be going into adaptability and adaptive intelligence, the superpower of today's leader. So, why does adaptability matter so much now? It's an overused word. But what I want you to think about is that this goes deeper in today's world of leadership. I think everybody talks about the pace of change as hotted up, that there's more complexity, that decisions have to be made faster. And we've heard a lot about agile decision making. And this is very true of what we're doing today. So leaders have to learn to adapt and adapt quickly and consciously adjust their thinking, their behaviour and their approach. And that's because quite often adaptability can come from an instant reaction. Something happens and we suddenly think, oh, that's not going to work, going to have to do this. Now that's great on one level, but it's not good enough to sustain a leader throughout their career and help them to make the most impact within their organisation and within their team. We need adaptability to be an intentional skill, not just a reactive moment. In an IBM study in 2023, 75% of CEOs said that the pace of change was outstripping their organisation's capacity for change. And that's why we need leaders who can adapt faster and can take others with them and help them to adapt quickly too. Because we've got brilliant, experienced leaders within organisations who are falling by the wayside simply because they're operating from an outdated mental model. And hard work alone won't close the gap. And that's often the solution, what people think is the solution. That only leads to burnout. What we need is to develop a different set of intelligence. Some of you will remember, if you listen to any of the early episodes of What Was Leadership Horizons, that we talked about the radar model. And I want to bring you back to that because the radar model is a great one for developing your adaptive intelligence. So the R in radar is for recognition. It's about noticing in the moment that something calls for something different. But it means not going straight into action because the A is about assess. So this means that you have to manage your instant drive for reaction because our brain reaches for familiar patterns. This is the basal ganglia part of our brain. And this just goes, oh, what did I do last time? But actually, if you recognize something needs to be done differently, and you then take the time to assess what that might be, that stops you either defaulting back to an old pattern or just doing something in the moment that might not be the right response. Assessment means examining our assumptions, looking at a problem or a challenge with fresh eyes and managing our emotional response. And then the D is for deciding what response is appropriate. Because this comes from our prefrontal cortex. Because what we've done in that pause, we've moved away from our amygdala, which is the reactive part of our brain, and we've allowed ourselves to go into our prefrontal cortex, which is the thinking part of our brain. Recognize, assess, and then decide before action. And then this is about confident action, even in uncertainty. One of the myths that we've really got to dispel is that any situation has perfect information at any one moment. That is just not true in terms of today's world. We're always going to be operating from incomplete or imperfect information. What we have to do is decide what's good enough. What is good enough information for us to make a decision now and then go forward acting with confidence. The final part of radar, which actually is the game changer, is we then review and we reflect and we learn, and you compound your adaptive capacity over time. Because actually, this is the bit that so many people don't do. They'll get a recognition that something is different. They won't take the time to assess. They'll just go straight from recognition into action, and then they don't review. And so what you get is decisions that haven't been taken with the right amount of preparation. Now, what I do want to stress is that I'm not talking about taking weeks over this, okay? The radar model can be followed through within 15 to 30 minutes. So this isn't about delaying action, but it's about giving yourself some time and space to think so that you can make the right call. So now I want to take you through some insights to help you think this through. So the first insight is that certainty addiction is the enemy of adaptability. We are addicted, our brains are addicted as human beings to search for certainty. But actually, if we're looking for certainty in situations where actually it's impossible to have certainty, what that leads us to is over-planning, over-controlling, and mistaking activity for strategy. Our negativity bias fires in uncertain environments. And when we feel the threat response, that shuts down the prefrontal cortex and we go back to the amygdala, which means we're reacting rather than providing a thought-through response. So the antidote, as I said earlier on, is we have to build that tolerance for good enough information. And this is challenging because, everybody's saying, well, how do we know it's good enough? You, as leaders, have to survey your environment and make some decisions about this, about what is good enough. But you do have to build a tolerance because it is counterintuitive, and most people find this very challenging. So one of the people that I worked with quite recently, he was a CEO in a manufacturing environment, and he was a meticulous planner. It was his superpower. He was a great planner, but actually he didn't have tolerance for imperfect information. And what was happening to him is his performance and that of his team was starting to drop because he wasn't able to use that same level of meticulous planning that had served him in the past. He had to build a tolerance for imperfect information and making a plan built on imperfect information and then go into confident action. Somebody who was delaying action because he didn't feel he had enough information, to somebody who could go, okay, we've got the best information we can get at this moment, and we are going to confidently respond based on that. And it took him time. He actually said that one of the ways that he practiced was, rather than look at a breakfast menu in advance, which is what would have been his usual practice to decide what he was going to have that morning, that he started making decisions based on what he could see. So he hadn't read the menu. He just went into the breakfast room and made a decision based on what he could see. And I actually love that metaphor and that way of practicing, because all the time he was building his adaptive intelligence. And it did change things for him. It changed him from being that person whose performance was failing. It raised his performance and it raised his team's performance. The second insight I want to talk to you about, which is building on this, is about the fact that adaptability is a team sport. Individual capacity matters, but teams can either amplify or constrain that. So including your team in all of these discussions, sharing the radar model with them, getting them to tolerate the imperfect information and make decisions based on that, is all going to help. But one of the things that is important is that you build in psychological safety with your team, because psychological safety generates psychological flexibility. It allows for multiple perspectives, it allows for the toleration of disagreement, and it allows you to make changes without drama. Drama is the enemy of high performance. Drama in teams where we go into casting people into roles of persecutor, victim and rescuer, that is never helpful to high performance. So what leaders need to help themselves to do and help their teams to do is to become more adult in their interactions. And I know that might be a challenging form of language for many people, but actually sometimes we see behaviour in organisations that isn't particularly adult, that does come from a fear response, that can come from a quite childlike place. But we can only do that if we build in the psychological safety as well. We also have to consider the polyvagal theory, which means that if we're in that space of feeling chronically under threat, then our amygdala is working overtime. And that is reducing our capacity to think, it reduces our curiosity, and it reduces our ability to be creative and challenge ourselves and challenge our assumptions. So adaptability does require psychological safety, and that's not soft, that's actually biology. So we need to be really mindful of this, that building trust and psychological safety within our team is going to raise the team's ability to become high performers and to work together to increase the team adaptive intelligence as well as individual adaptive intelligence. Third insight, self-awareness. Adaptive leaders are self-aware. Self-awareness is the foundation of both emotional and adaptive intelligence. And without it, the radar model, none of these theories work. So I've said this before, that one of the fundamental and important and significant things that leaders need to do to develop themselves is to develop their own self-awareness, because without that, nothing's going to work. There's lots of research around this. The Korn Ferry group, who used to be Hay Group, they produced the Emotional and Social Intelligence Index. Self-awareness is massive on that. If anyone's read any of Viktor Frankl's work, which is so powerful, and he talks about in the space between stimulus and response lies growth, but that's not possible unless we understand our own triggers, and that comes back to self-awareness. So we have to, as leaders, work on our self-awareness. So what are some practical tips to help you with this? First tip, a weekly radar check-in. I would suggest that you do this individually and that you also encourage it as a team activity as well. So, and this is just a 10-minute activity. For yourself, end of the week or beginning of the week is really good. For your teams, whenever it's your team meeting, it can be either your opener or something that's built in fairly high on your team agenda. And the questions on this check-in are, where did I need to adapt and I didn't? Where did I adapt well? What assumptions am I working on that I might need to challenge? Those three questions are really important. So many leaders are too busy doing stuff and they don't take the time out to think. So, a reflection, a weekly check-in. Second tip, deliberate perspective taking. And this is about taking perspectives that are contrary to your own so that you get a wider view. I'd suggest that you choose a stakeholder whose view you find hardest to understand and spend 5 minutes genuinely arguing their case to yourself. Now, this isn't necessarily about changing your view or agreeing with their perspective, but it is about deepening your understanding. Because if you don't understand that point of view, there is absolutely no way that you can take it into account. And remember that people who have a different point of view for yours are not necessarily resisting you. The resistance makes complete sense from where they're standing, but you have to understand that to be able to come to some common ground with them. I had a great example of this in the last couple of weeks with somebody that I was working with. She came to her coaching session because she's involved in a big project that involves multiple teams. And she'd been in 2 or 3 meetings where she was trying to convince members of other teams of something that she didn't believe would work and that was holding the project up. But all she said to me was that they didn't want to listen. They didn't want to hear my point of view because from their perspective, everything was fine. I took her back to what might be going on for them. Where are they coming from and here? What might be the points that have something in them that they're putting forward? And what happened then was that she got a deeper understanding of where they might be coming from, and she figured out a different way of approaching them so that they might be much more open to hearing her. Because if we push against resistance, which is often a natural reaction, all we do is raise it. So taking in and being very deliberate about taking in perspectives that are different to ours increases our adaptive intelligence and also helps to lower resistance both in ourselves and in others. Third tip, create your adapt or defend trigger list. Write down 3 to 5 triggers, situations, people, types of feedback, things that you know trigger you. And next to each one, a question to interrupt the pattern. A good question is, am I protecting my view, my team, or my identity here? Or could this be a genuinely good idea? The example I gave about my coachee, she was protecting her team. But actually what she needed to do was to be more open-minded and understand the perspectives of other teams in order to get a good result and see where there might be value in their ideas and not just in her own. And the goal here is to stop your strong views or ingrained and rigid biases stopping you from learning, because that's what rigid thinking does. It stops us from learning. It closes us down as opposed to opening us up. And adaptive intelligence requires us to be open. So let's do a quick recap. We've looked again at the radar model and how that can assist adaptive intelligence. We've thought about 3 insights around this: the certainty addiction, the fact that adaptability is a team sport, and the importance of increasing our self-awareness. And I've given you 3 tips: the radar check-in, the deliberate perspective taking, and the trigger list. So my challenge to you this week is to pick 1 tip and do it this week, because getting into action really makes the difference. The gap between knowing something and thinking about it and actually doing it is where leadership development can either thrive or die. So I want you to get into action this week. I want you to pick 1 of those tips and actually do it. I'd love to know how you get on. So please come and find me either on LinkedIn or on loisburtononline.com. If you want to also talk about any coaching, team coaching, or just further conversation, I'd be so happy to hear from you. And share this episode with a leader who you think needs it or will benefit from it. Subscribe, share, and follow. I'll see you next week. Keep leading forward. This is Leadership Trailblazers.